Okay, hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, and I'm so happy to be talking with Holly Dunsworth. Hello, Holly.
Hi, David.
You are well known to TVOL readers. In fact, I think you might have the #1 most popular article on TVOL on why the human female vagina is so big. And now you have a second article, which might actually rival the first one, but for different reasons. And actually, I don't have it in front of me. The title of your second article is?
It is Unethical to Teach Evolution Without Confronting Racism and Sexism.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
And so let's begin with the first one. What was the point of your first article? Very, very quickly. And then it's going to come back, I think, when we talk about your second article.
Okay. So I haven't read it in a while, but the point of that article, why is the human vagina so big, was, if you noticed, you probably never heard that question asked before. And someone cleverer than me said I should have titled it, "Why is man's vagina so big?" You see, because here we are, in this story of the evolution of mankind, focused so much on, certain aspects of human evolution, and maybe to the detriment of understanding them in a more complete way. And so the article I wrote, "Why is the human vagina so big?" was a way of playfully, because we can, getting at this narrow focus on the evolution of the penis, and on the narrow focus on competition and mate choice, like women are choosing bigger for being better. Right. And there are actually a lot of reasons why the human penis is shaped and sized the way it is, and I explored some of those while kind of poking fun at some of the explanations that have circulated in the past.
Yeah, right. Okay, so all good. So now with your new article, I mean, this is such an interesting topic for me, and the many, many articles on TVOL explore this general area. And I've read your article, of course. I've read the comments. I've read Jared Coyne's piece on that article. I've also read an article by Jonathan Marks that you cite and link to.
I link to those too, also because they're open access for anyone who wants to access.
That's right. Mark's article is titled "Why Be Against Darwin? Creationism, Racism, and the Roots of Anthropology." And I have to confess that I have some kind of a degree of sympathy on all sides. And so, although I'm going to agree with you about a bunch, I'm going to push back on some of it also. That's fine. That's what we do as scientists. I think there's more than one way to err, basically. And that it's really important for us to get this right, because in an age where there's so much disagreement and polarization and people mischaracterizing each other and not talking with each other, if we can't do better as scientists, not just as evolutionists, but as scientists, then shame on us, basically. We need to provide a model of science as a process of constructive disagreement. So that's what I want to do. And let's see, I think maybe, do I want to emphasize our shared? Yeah, let's emphasize our zone of agreement here. Or maybe actually what you could do in your own words is to just very briefly summarize the thrust of your article. What were the points that you really wanted to get across?
Okay, so there was actually a lot that went into it, and by the myriad reactions to it, people picked up on that. The main thrust of it is that evolution has a public relations problem, and it's not just due to literal biblical interpretation or to science denial. It is because of bad or inaccessible science, and because bad or narrow or biased or ridiculous interpretations of decent science. And it's been going on for over 150 years with evolutionary science. And I think I would like to be part of something that sees change in that. And I think it's important because we're talking about people's roots. We're talking about where people came from. And this is, and it should be, everyone's origin story. Everyone's.
Sure. Okay. Okay. And okay, so you want to end there? I mean, that's the main thing you wanted to get across.
I have lots to say, but you know, it can come out at different points of the discussion.
Yeah. So I feel that, of course, I agree with that, and I think that creationism is only part of the story. I think one thing that Jerry Coyne pointed out, which I agree with, is that one reason that evolution is hard to accept is that it's threatening in one way or another, and the religious threat, the threat to religious belief is one. Then there's many other threats, and social Darwinism is another. So anyone who's threatened by what they regard as social Darwinism has a reason to reject evolution, along with just like a religious a believer. And so, as I say in my book, Evolution for Everyone, the key to making evolution acceptable is to make it unthreatening, explanatory, and useful. Whenever something is unthreatening, explanatory, and useful, then it will be embraced. Otherwise, it will be rejected. I think one of the things that's lurking behind this in my own mind, which is an evolutionary statement to make about epistemology, the nature of knowledge, and you actually begin your piece this way. I was actually kind of amused. You begin your piece by saying, one thing's for sure, we're storytelling animals. Mm-hmm. We can say there's a true statement about evolution, is that we tell stories to each other, we thrive and live on stories. I think an elaboration of that is that we construct meaning systems whose primary purpose is to motivate our behaviors, not to directly apprehend reality, but basically to cause us to behave in ways that are that help us get by. The mind is constructed not to apprehend factual reality, but to apprehend practical reality, and that provides, I think, a master explanation for why we often invent and embrace falsehoods, and why we often reject scientific truths. And that applies way beyond religion. One of my favorite books on the topic is called The Invention of Tradition. And it's about how what almost all cultures have traditions that are regarded as ancient and venerable, but almost all of those customs are much more recent and more or less designed to orchestrate the comings and goings of those cultures. And scientists are no more immune to that than anybody else, basically. Right. But scientists are expected to play according to a certain set of rules, basically, which is more respectful of what we call objective reality. And so we have to fashion our meaning systems out of that. But that doesn't mean it's easy. And it also doesn't mean we know what we're doing, because so much of this takes place beneath conscious awareness that we're not being immoral, certainly not consciously immoral. This is the air that we breathe, and nobody can even see it until often after the passage of time. But what I want to push back a little bit on with your account is it gives the impression that evolutionary thinking has led only to abuses, when I think there's many strands, and I suspect that you'll agree with this. Yeah. That, in which evolutionary thinking was used in ways that were inclusive and so on. And on that topic, I wanted to return to Jonathan Mark's article, which I read and and really liked.
Mhm.
So, and he gives, I think, a more nuanced account. So let me give you some elements of his account, which I think is what.
Yeah. Let me butt in for a second. When I wrote this, I was writing it. I wrote it on The Mermaid's Tale, my blog first.
Yeah.
And all readers of The Mermaid's Tale, I mean, that I'm imagining I'm talking to when I'm writing this, they're on some level aware of me and that I'm an evolutionary scientist,
Right.
and that I would never be insinuating that the entire field of evolutionary science is all doing bad science and is all racist and sexist.
Yeah, so I think so.
Yeah, so once it got on your magazine and it had a broad readership with people who don't know me and they're out of that context, I think it changed, and that was not my intention.
Well, I mean, our audience, the TVOL's audience, is also very informed evolutionarily, also. So
I think I triggered some people with the words patriarchy and misogyny, and then I think they put me on the anti-science side of things,
right.
and
Yeah.
then read it through that lens instead of what it was and who, coming from a place of what I do and who I am. So anyway, that was just to butt in and give you some explanation and context for that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons it's important to have this interview is to set some of these straight. But this goes way beyond, I think, this piece or you as the author. I think this divide is, I mean, it's really strong in a number of ways. You can take someone like Jonathan Marks or Jerry Coyne or so on, and there's all sorts of people that are like not talking to each other. You could take myself and Richard Dawkins. You could take, and so I think that that's what I mean. I really want to be like systemic in discussing this.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's one of the things I admire about Jonathan in that piece, and you in other pieces. So, is to be suitably nuanced and also scholarly, basically, about the history of ideas. And here's another thing that I agree with you about, that science, including evolution, is so bound up with meaning systems of various sorts that you can't really talk about science without also talking about the social context. And so the idea that we have science classes and we have ethics classes, and they should never be mixed, or they don't need to be mixed, that we can teach a course on evolution that just, sticks to the science. We don't need to talk about these other issues, is something. No, I'm definitely with you on that. Jerry Coyne said something interesting. He said, give me a break. When I teach my half of a course, I have 17 lectures to teach all of evolution. Please allow me to just focus on the fruit flies.
There are other alternatives to putting it directly in the class. And no one asked me a question until you called me up. None of the responses were asking me questions. They were just weighing in with their opinions and many personal attacks. So, I mean, I have, there are alternatives to putting it directly into the classroom with a lecture.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can talk about those if you want later.
But so here are some things that a scholarly knowledge of the subject reveals, in which Jonathan Marks revealed in his article. In the first place, the primary or the initial impact of Darwin's theory was to provide a really strong argument for the abolitionists, such as Darwin, that now they had a more powerful way of talking about the psychic unity of mankind, as they put it back then, that all races are a single species. And so this was a powerful positive argument in favor of racial equality. Then he goes on to say that in the process of arguing for identity by descent, German scientists such as Haeckel indeed resurrected a kind of a hierarchy of races, with blacks midway between apes and whites and so on. He describes it as kind of like a unfortunate, a very unfortunate byproduct of trying to explain or establish identity by descent. He also goes on to say that things fell the other way in England, and in England it got interpreted basically the evolutionary narrative. We're talking about narrative. There were, like, right off the bat, two narratives. There was a German narrative and a British narrative,
right.
which fell on both sides of the divide. In my own writing, I like to emphasize that the philosophical tradition of pragmatism was inspired by Darwin. And one prominent pragmatist is John Dewey, who is beloved as a progressive thinker and called his approach an evolutionary approach. There's a much stronger link between Dewey and Darwin than Hitler and Darwin, and for which there's really essentially no link. And here I'm relying on the scholarship of Robert Richards, and he has a book called "Was Hitler a Darwinian?" And so I think that something that your article on TVOL, not the full corpus of your work, but the article on TVOL is kind of easy to infer from it, is like evolutionary thinking is the bad guy. And so I think that's unfortunate because that's been like the for many people, the received view of social Darwinism is that there's something about evolutionary theory that is especially prone to misuse. And I actually think that the historical record does not support that one little bit. So I'm eager to have your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm still kind of surprised that even you would read that I'm somehow painting evolutionary theory entirely to blame for, for eugenics or for social Darwinism or for any racism or sexism in our culture, that it is entirely bad. I thought that starting out with a very personal and to the degree that I feel vulnerable, kind of rant at the beginning, basically, a love letter to evolution. That I thought that would, and other things I said throughout would, including suggesting that we keep teaching it. I mean, that should also, support, my hopefully perceived understanding that evolution is not even close to being all bad. I would stop teaching it if I thought it was. I mean, it's not at all. It's wonderful. It's nature, it's biology. It's just where the world works. And I love it. I love thinking about it. It's what gives me, besides rock and roll and the love of my family and laughter, it gives me the most meaning in life to work with evolution and to do evolutionary science and to teach it. So I'm so glad you gave me the platform to say that just now. But I know I sounded to some people pretty strange writing the way I did to start off that piece, but it was so that I could hopefully gain the trust of people who need to hear what I said from either side, from the education and science side or from the student side, where they're maybe averse to evolution. They're avoiding it. They don't feel like they can claim it. They have been rejected by the own telling of their own natural history, and that's unacceptable. And we need to. They deserve, and we all deserve, a better story. And it's not one. That's sort of the deal too. There are so many, and so as soon as we can face that fact, that there are many ways, there are facts, right? There are scientific facts, and then there are the stories we tell with those facts. And to treat those stories, which that's not a pejorative, by the way, to me. That's not a pejorative term at all, but to some people it is, and I'm sorry. But to treat those stories as if they're just as much fact as the facts themselves is, I think, a bad habit in evolutionary science. And if everybody can learn the difference and to be aware of all that, I think we could accept different stories but also tell better ones, and maybe also get better facts in order to tell better stories. So I think there's so much to unpack in that piece. It's been boiling in me and stewing in me for a long time, and so I just I'm glad you gave me the chance to stand up for myself a little bit, because I do feel bad if anybody read it and thought that I was just trashing evolution entirely, because that's just not even close to what I was going for.
That's why I was eager to have this conversation, and also more than that. But I mean, I really intend to and also my colleague Eric Michael Johnson to basically explore this, as we have. I mean, we have a whole series on truth and reconciliation for social Darwinism, and many more. I'll link to some of them in our interview. You mentioned some people as kind of examples of not doing things right. So I want to explore that a little bit. And the one person I'd like to focus on, because his work I know very well, is Jonathan Haidt. And so you mentioned him with others as kind of like part of the problem. And could we explore that a little bit? Because I think there's some interesting things to explore there. So let's try.
So in that paragraph, I was careful to emphasize the takeaways from, emphasize their influence rather than they themselves and what they are saying. The spiraling out of their influence, like the ripples. So that because I'm glad you wanted to talk about Jonathan Haidt, because I did too. I read Coddling of the American Mind just now, and it scared me. And I thought overall, I really got a lot out of it, and I'm glad I read it. It's a good book. I respect him as a scholar. It just did, leave a strong impression on me, because more than several times when he summed up his, it was very, he would sum up his points like 1, 2, 3, and then move on. And several times he would root it all in humans are tribal. There was always this like foundation in this, ancient epic cause that wasn't explored to the degree that he explored the present issues he was describing. Unlike some of my colleagues, I don't feel like he was blaming professors, especially liberal professors, for issues that students or campuses are facing right now. I didn't feel attacked. I thought it was really well done. I really valued the work he put into that and his book. So that means, and him too. But I really thought it was kind of astounding that he had to root it all in constantly in this idea that humans are tribal. And that's a whole other essay that I actually pitched to the Washington Post, and they rejected. So
doesn't quite have the same circulation, but
yeah. So that's what I was saying when, with these tropes from Descent of Man, and David Brooks is on the tribalism bandwagon, and he's also on the he's on the genetic determinism side of things that I think is unhealthy and unscientific. So both. So that's why they were listed there.
Well, so lots to talk about here. Let's begin with tribalism. It seems to me that there is plenty of evidence for what you could call us versus them psychology that's very easily triggered in humans, going all the way back to the minimal group experiments of social psychologists, that there is something about the human mind that really searches for an us. Actually, having an us does not mean being hostile to a them. The research also shows that. But that we are a very groupish species, and part of that requires being identified with a group. We're lucky that the boundaries of that are very flexible. And a paper I like to cite is by Rob Kurzban, in which he showed that simply by framing something as in terms of sports teams with red and blue jerseys can trump race. So, you know, I mean, without red and blue jerseys, if you show a photograph of someone, the first thing they notice is their race. In a sports scenario, the first thing they notice is the red and blue jerseys. So I'm actually just fine with thinking. In fact, I think it's very important. I think it's part of what we could call.
There's so much more to what anthropologists understand as a tribe, or being part of a tribe, or the life of a tribe's person, or what that means. There's so much more than than this notion of competition with other tribes, and to the exclusion, you know, the identity and exclusion, the inclusion exclusion. Like that seems to be the only small aspect of being a human that the word tribalism evokes and symbolizes.
Yeah.
And why not call it something else? So in a way, normally I have to write things like this out so that I have something coherent to say when I actually talk about them. But I mean, it's just it's a way to root his argument, and like others do, in this ancient past that's part of human nature, that's just an indelible trait of humanity. And while kind of I feel a little bit on the spot here, especially at this low point in my time of day, my intellectual capacity. But it just doesn't feel, it just doesn't feel very scientific or very anthropologically informed at the same time. And yet, after that, he lays out great arguments. They seem very well researched, and for you know, his observations and his conclusions about campus culture right now. And so it just seems almost seems silly, and maybe that's why I'm reacting to it, because it sort of makes my field out to be like this silly thing you can just tack on to anything just to make your argument seem more epic than it is. And that's all. It's the impression I get. It's not necessarily anything on his end. And but this is what, you know, people are. I'm struggling with this because I believe that people deserve to tell the stories about our origins in the ways that they find meaningful. But I take issue with it when people have great influence and do it alongside their own expertise. And so it seems like it can give the impression to people that they're influencing that their evolutionary story is just as scientific as their own science. That's all. So I struggle with this because of what I just said.
Well, this is lots to say in reply, and I want to go back to Jonathan Mark's article, which I think so highly of. I have a few quibbles with it, but for the most part, I think he nails a bunch of points. And one of those points is he makes a distinction between ancestry and emergence, kind of two sides to the evolutionary coin. And if you focus on ancestry, that makes it seem like things are immutable. We're apes, and so therefore we must behave as apes, or at least it's okay to behave as apes. On the emergence side, then it doesn't matter where we came from. We're in the process of emerging into something else. And he very, wisely, I think, ties that to old debates in evolution, such as between Lamarckism and the Weismann doctrine.
Right.
Something which you think is purely biological, not having to do with humans per se at all. But no, actually, there's no topic which actually isn't permeated by politics, is one thing he would say and that I would agree with. And so it turns out that really the acceptance of the Weismann doctrine and really evolution becoming almost entirely gene-centric.
Yeah.
So when you say evolution, we hear genes. We don't hear cultural evolution. We don't hear other forms of evolution is actually part of these
development, huge. Development gets kicked to the curb as only proximate instead of ultimate. And it doesn't count as evolutionary still in some people's minds. It's so strange.
But I think that there's a problem in calling it bad science, for one thing. There's all kinds of hypotheses that are well within the bounds of scientific plausibility. And some of those posit innate sex differences and innate differences in, I use the word race very provisionally because this is part of the whole problem. I mean, based on what we know about evolution being a rapid process, there's ample scope. I mean, first of all, it's eminently plausible, and there's tons of evidence for what we would call local adaptation, basically. Populations being selected for different things. We have our outstanding examples, such as the evolution of lactose tolerance and all that. Now that does not map onto race as most people think of it. And we have great evolutionists such as Joseph Graves and others who are here to tell us that are fully comfortable with genetic diversity, including a between population component of that, but not confusing that with racism. By the same token, there's ample scope for innate differences between males and females, which it should be possible to accept without that leading to anything that could be called sexist. And so, one such hypothesis is that actually, there's one I want to go to in a fair amount of detail. Shall I do that or not? Why not? It'll only take me a few minutes.
Okay.
But it's so very interesting, super interesting. And one fascinating thing I think is that when we, depending on the kind of the domain or the that we're talking about, things can be totally flipped. So on the one hand, we could be very skeptical about innate sex differences, for example, or innate racial differences. But on the other hand, if we're told that 99% of medical research is done on white males, and then we expect the discoveries of that research to apply equally to females and to all other people, we say, what? That's monstrous. That you should think that you should do all that research on white males and expect everyone else to be like them. But what is that?
I mean that the differences are innate, though.
What's that?
That's a great example, but it also doesn't mean we should conclude that any of the differences are due to innate or genetic.
True, because there could be big differences between them. But of course, it might well be innate.
Right.
And so Bernard Crespi, a really good evolutionary psychologist, studies autism spectrum disorder from an evolutionary perspective. And he has a video that I will link to, 17 minutes long. I wish everyone could watch it. And so I'll give you the speed version. It says that there's, when you look at the genetic basis of autism spectrum disorders, there's two kinds of genes. One are mutant genes. They tend to be of large effect. They go away pretty fast because they're causing something which is, highly maladaptive. And so they're very rare in the population. Then you get a whole bunch of genes that are, because this is very polygenic, multigenic. A lot of genes that are implicated in autism spectrum disorder, but they're also common in the population. How can this be? It is because although they're manifested, they have as a negative effect in some people, they're a positive effect in other people, and it's the net effect that's maintaining them at a high frequency in the population. And then he goes on to speculate, it is a speculation, that there's kind of two major human adaptations. One is object manipulation. We're a technological species, we're really good at that. And the other is our social skills. We're a highly social species. And these adaptations kind of trade off with each other. They're not the same. And so it's certainly possible for a single person to have an abundance of one and a paucity of another. I haven't said anything about sex yet. I'm talking about individual differences. And so if you could imagine, and all of this is multigenic, so if you could imagine a bell-shaped curve, and in the middle of it, most of the stuff that's going on is adaptive, functional, but the tails are dysfunctional. So this is a kind of big stabilizing selection. And on one tail, you have like the excess of object manipulation. Those are the autism spectrum disorders. And on the other hand, you have an excess of social adaptations. These are things like schizophrenia and extreme anxiety and so on and so forth. And so these are the, this is the result of sexual recombination, basically. Every generation, a small fraction of people get dealt a really bad hand, and these are the consequences. There's other research on this. I'm thinking of a paper by Matthew Keller and Jeffrey Miller that makes the same point, that kind of, things like depression and anxiety in their normal range, those have adaptive explanations, but in the extreme, really debilitating depression and things like that, these are actually people that have unfortunately been dealt a very bad hand of genes. And an important implication of this that he draws out is that it basically connects disorders that seem the opposite from each other, so that you could actually, knowing what we know about the genetic basis of autism spectrum disorders, we can say something about the genetic basis of the disorders at the other extreme. And in fact, some of the same medications that are used to downregulate for one could be used to upregulate for the other. And then finally, there's the possibility that there can be a sex difference, and that if you look at these distributions, then let us say that there is an average sex difference with respect to object manipulation versus social skills. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is right, but I am saying it's well within the bounds of scientific inquiry. I would not call this bad science. And all depends on which way the coin falls in terms of what ends up being true. But if that scenario ended up, after suitable empirical inquiry, ended up being more or less true, I think that it would not be or should not be disturbing or detrimental to an enlightened social policy, basically. I don't see how that could lead to, it could lead, but I don't see how it would need to lead to anything that we would regard as sexist. So that took me a long time to get through. But
I'm not linking up. I'm not linking the hypotheses, informed hypotheses, up to social policy.
well, if you take, for example, the notorious Google document, what was that fellow trying to say? He was trying to say what?
Kind of like he was trying to say there are natural differences that somehow should inform who works where. Like natural sex and race, both natural differences due to ancestry and due to sex, that should factor into how we hire or employ people in what positions. That's what it sounded like.
Well, yeah. Well, then when that connects to policy, but the science part of that is that it might just be that there is, especially at the high end, and this is where Larry Summers got in trouble, and which lost him his presidency at Harvard University, when he said that, you know, especially on the high end of the distribution, there actually is a big sex difference.
I don't think that's what got him in trouble. Okay. Noticing that there's a difference, I don't think got him in trouble. I think it was, I can't remember exactly, but I'm sure that noticing that there's a difference wouldn't be enough to get him in trouble. I'm sure it had to do something with how he suggested it got that way. And what it means for how we treat people. So for me, I don't struggle at all with biological difference, but I struggle with why it should be even on the table for something like policy, because you can't then narrow down and evaluate an individual based on a group trend.
Right.
Individuals don't, you know, that the group trends are going to be one thing, but the individuals are going to do whatever the individuals do. So it's hard for me to understand how to go from biological difference to like a fair and useful social policy.
Right. And so and I want to nail this down, because I think this, I know from reading the comments to your article and elsewhere, that some of the readers are saying, like, you're in denial about innate sex differences. I mean, I know that's not true. That's actually why I began with your first article.
Yeah.
And so take something like, for example, sexual dimorphism. We all know that the average male is bigger than the average female around the world. And then the question is why. So your beef, I think, is similar to your beef about the vagina as the question that's not asked. Everyone wants to know about penis size. They don't think about vagina size and so on.
Right.
So I take you as saying, yeah, these differences are innate, but why? Is it because men have been clubbing each other and so on? Maybe it's for different reasons. Could you just elaborate on that and make sure that I'm right in my own impression?
Yeah. So, you know, when people ask why are men all around the world on average taller than women all around the world? Everywhere you go, this is true. You know, everybody, you know, for everybody who has a decent answer focuses on male competition. That competition with other males for pretty much for access to females, and females choosing the winners of those contests is responsible for males being taller than females. So it ratcheted up their height over time. And they look to all the rest of the apes, or the apes, depending on whether you're John Marks or not. They're just the apes, or they're the rest of the apes. I don't know. So you look at the small-bodied gibbons and siamangs, and they have very, very little difference in male-female body size. It's not there. And they are pair bonded, or as some people like to call monogamous, which I don't, because they don't get married. And then a little bigger in the apes, we've got bonobos and chimpanzees, and they're different in the realm of our difference. Like they're kind of in our ballpark. but compared to gorillas and orangutans, who are much larger apes, they have great levels of difference. They have, or sexual dimorphism in body size. Males can be twice as big as females. That's not at all what we've got. Okay, so people look to them and they say, look, gorillas and orangutans have so much competition. They fend off other males for access to a group of females. They keep them away. That's a huge amount of competition. That explains why they're so big. And then as compared to the gibbons, which, you know, they pair bond, so they have only one female to deal with. So they don't have a lot of, all the other males do too, and they're not competing as much or at all. All right, and then you look to us and you say, well, we have somewhere in between, like chimps and bonobos. Maybe we should look to chimps and bonobos and see what kind of competition is going on there. And that's how we're going to describe our own evolutionary history, which isn't bad anyway, since we're most closely related to bonobos and chimps anyway. Okay, but yeah, the story leaves out why, as Sarah Hurdy pointed out and many others have pointed out, why it doesn't explain why females didn't get bigger either, unless somewhere implicit in this explanation is that males have to be bigger than females in order to win competitions, like over females. Like there's something like that going on, and that's usually not in the discussion. It's usually male-male competition.
Right.
So why wouldn't females get bigger if bigger is better? And females compete like crazy all over the primate world and beyond. And so there's less space in the literature devoted to this idea, but it's still there, and it's sometimes called females as the ecological sex, and that body size is more constrained in at least female primates, but probably, you know, down the line, that this is usually, the literature I'm familiar with is in the primate literature. And that body size is constrained among female primates just because they're the ones getting pregnant, and that's a terrible strain on their metabolism, and it all depends on their energetic context. So not just pregnancy, but lactation and carrying the kid or kids. So all those costs mean their body size is constrained evolutionarily. Okay. So what I didn't write about, so you're referring to the Washington Post essay that I wrote, I think. And that came out of a little Twitter, I don't know, storm or something, in response to some claims that Jerry Coyne was making about how any resistance to the notion of male competition explaining body size sex difference is just feminist, anti-science, you know, liberal, lefty, dumb talk. So I had a beef with that. So then I wrote a Washington Post essay about it to a degree, and then since then, that was a couple years ago, I really looked into the literature, and this is a paper I've got in review, in the second round of review right now. I revised it and resubmitted it. I looked at the biology of the skeletal biology and what is known. And as far as I can tell, there aren't any differences in skeletal biologies of men and women, of males and females in humans. And, you know, we grow pretty much the same until, you know, boys and girls grow up kind of on the same, basically in the same trajectory until girls have their first period. And then there's a deceleration in growth, and then they stop growing. Meanwhile, males continue, and then they decelerate and stop. And that's similar in the other apes as well. And what's happening is there's much more estrogen in the body of developing girls when they reach menarche, they reach that first period, when their organs are starting to function that are all requiring estrogen. And estrogen is actually biphasic in terms of its effect on the skeleton. So you reach one level of estrogen, and it's elongating your bones, it's stimulating bone growth, and you're getting taller and taller and taller. You reach another level of estrogen, and it's stimulating all those growth plates to fuse, to stop growing. Girls get to that higher level of estrogen faster than boys do. Eventually boys do too. We all, convert androgens to estrogen in our bodies with aromatase. And so, I mean, if boys got their period, they'd stop growing too. It doesn't look like, as far as I can tell, and I tried, it doesn't look like you need an advantage to being taller to explain why men get taller.
Oh, well, I think we need to curtail.
I tried hard to find it all last year of my research.
Well, I think, I mean, you could have that result and you could have all of those mechanisms, and it could still be the case that male-male competition is responsible in a functional sense for the dimorphism or not. I mean, it could be just the trade-off that you're talking about.
What do you mean?
Well, I think the most important, well, if the male-male competition hypothesis was correct, and so in functional terms, that was the adaptive explanation for why males are taller than females. If you then go look at the developmental mechanisms and the process,
which are adaptive, reproduction is adaptive, and so is probably it's linked to skeletal growth.
I think the most important point you're making is similar to the one that you made about the vagina, is that just because you have this particular sex difference doesn't mean that necessarily that male-male competition is the factor, especially when you look at it more holistically. Then it could be that women are subject to different trade-offs than and that's the reason. So we're not considering the full range of hypotheses.
Right, but there is actually a way to test, I think now, knowing what I know about skeletal biology, there's actually a way to test the competition hypothesis without continuing to just measure male body size and how many offspring they have and counting their, tallying up their fitness and trying to do paternity in the wild. I think there's actually a way to test that sexual selection idea by looking at the development of the skeleton and the reproductive system. Okay. And if there are any differences in humans, and then if there are any differences between the sexes or between us and other species. I think there's a way to do that now.
But I want to ask a question. What difference does it make policy-wise? I mean, let's say that at the end of the day, we concluded that human sexual dimorphism was in part due to male-male competitions.
Yeah.
Does it make a difference as far as our policies are concerned?
I don't know. I don't think in terms of policy as a result, like you do. I'm sorry. I just don't, I don't think that way about the value of evolutionary thinking. I think about it as useful in medicine and how it affects how we approach the body. And I think about it in terms, obviously, like I said before, in terms of like a meaningful approach to being alive and living in this earth and being a human as a part of nature, like Darwin said. I just don't have, I'd have to really think about it now.
In your article, you talk about Donald Trump bragging and his peculiar theory of.
So they titled it that, by the way. I used him as an example, but they titled it How Donald Trump Got Human Evolution Wrong. Right. And it made readers think I was writing about Donald Trump, and I wasn't.
Yeah. So, I mean.
But it got the clicks. It got the clicks.
I know it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I think that I think we've had a great conversation, and I think that hopefully people will see a lot more nuance. That if they didn't get that from your article, then they do now, and that's what this has been about. And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, it was great talking to you. You know, I was raised on your articles in graduate school when I first started reading your work, and it's been a pleasure finally getting to talk to you.
Okay, well.
And I have lots more questions for you, but maybe for some other time.
Okay, well, that's what this view of life is supposed to be about. Constructive disagreement. So, or of course, agreement. So. Anyhow, awesome talking with you.
Awesome talking with you.
Until the next time.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.